No land force can act decisively unless it is accompanied by a maritime superiority. For proof of this, we have only to recur to the instances of the ease and facility with which the British shifted their ground as advantages were to be obtained at either extremity of the continent, and to their late heavy loss the moment they failed in their naval superiority. It follows then, as certain as that night succeeds the day, that without a decisive naval force we can do nothing definitive, and with it everything honorable and glorious.
George Washington was writing to the Marquis de Lafayette shortly after the Americans' victory over the British at Yorktown in 1781. Support by the French Navy at that battle, and by both the French and Spanish navies earlier in the war, had been critical to winning the American Revolutionary War and securing independence. America had its own navy during the war, but it was despairingly small compared to the navies of both its allies and its enemies. It's not that America lacked sailors. The former British colonies were stretched out along the coast. Goods shipped from Boston to Charleston were quite literally shipped, and merchant vessels maintained a steady flow of goods between America and Europe, as well as the Caribbean islands. And many of the colonial sailors would have been experienced in naval combat on armed merchant vessels granted letters of marque and reprisal. These documents, provided by Britain and other European nations, gave private parties the authority to attack enemy vessels. Do that without a letter of marque and you're a pirate. But with the proper documentation, you're a privateer. During Britain's not infrequent wars with France and Spain, American privateers got plenty of opportunities to learn how to man guns and board a ship. But privateers are not a navy. They lack the discipline, coordination, command, and firepower of naval warships. Throughout its history, America's shipping and coastal security had been protected by the greatest naval power in the world, the British Royal Navy. Britain had 131 ships of the line, the most powerful warships of the day. Only about a third were battle-ready, but to combat them, the Americans had none. Nor did they have a navy. Not until on October 13th, 1775, when the Continental Congress passed the resolution creating the Continental Navy. They ordered the building of some vessels and the purchase of others. By the end of the year, 17 ships were ready for service. Over the course of the war, the Navy would only ever have about 65 ships. Fewer than a dozen would survive the war, the rest being destroyed or captured. America would need privateers to augment the Navy. Between 1,700 and 2,000 privateer ships sailed on behalf of the new American nation, preying upon British merchants and transport ships throughout the war. The first captain given command of a Continental Navy warship was John Barry, considered by many to be the father of the American Navy. Barry captained the USS Lexington in 1776, capturing numerous enemy ships. And he commanded the USS Alliance when it won the final naval battle of the Revolutionary War in 1783. One of the most famous seamen of the American Navy was the Scottish-born John Paul Jones. Appointed a first lieutenant of the Navy on December 22, 1775, Jones was the first man to hoist the American flag on a naval warship. Jones had numerous successes at sea, and it wasn't long before he was made captain. During his service, he commanded various ships, either as a captain or as a commodore, a senior captain of a naval squadron. His most famous battle came while he commanded a small squadron of ships off the coast of England. The flagship of the squadron was a French merchant vessel, which he had converted to a warship with a battery of 40 guns. He renamed the ship Bonhomme Richard in honor of Benjamin Franklin's Poor Richard's Almanac. In September 1779, Jones led his squadron up and down the English coast, hunting merchant ships bound for London. On September 23rd, he spotted a British convoy of merchant ships carrying goods to England from the Baltic Sea region, and Jones gave chase. The merchants were escorted by 2 British warships. Jones chose the larger of the two, the 50-gun Serapis, for battle with the Bonhomme Richard. The Serapis was bigger, faster, more maneuverable than Jones' ship, and its crew was much more disciplined. Yet, Jones threw his ship into the fight, bringing the Bonhomme Richard within pistol range of the Serapis. Things looked bad for the Americans. Over half the ship's officers had been killed or wounded. The starboard gunnery was all but gone. 18-pound shot had pierced the hull of the ship multiple times, and it was taking on water. And so, the captain of the Serapis called out to Jones, asking if Jones' ship had struck its colors, meaning surrendered. And Jones famously responded, "I have not even begun to fight." The ships pulled apart, and the broadsiding continued. But a fortunate wind and Jones' seamanship brought the Richard around and against the Serapis, bow to stern. Jones lashed the ships together, and the primary weapons shifted from cannons to muskets. The French Marines had lost their captain and lieutenants, so Jones took command of them and took up a musket to fire along with them. The British captain fought to separate the ships, knowing that if the battle returned to broadsides from cannon, he was certain to win. Jones knew that as well, and he directed his French Marines to fire at any British sailor attempting to cut the ropes holding the ships together. Fires broke out on both ships multiple times. Half the men on both ships were killed or disabled. One of the ships of Jones' squadron actually fired into both the Richard and Serapis, doing as much damage to Jones's ship as to the enemy. At one point, one of the Richard's gunners, believing his ship to be sinking, called out to the enemy for quarter. But before the British captain could respond, Jones knocked his gunner down with the butt of his pistol. Again and again, it seemed the Richard had no chance. But then, finally, the battle turned in Jones's favor. He had ordered men to drop hand grenades into the Serapis' main hatch. Now, one finally landed amid a pile of cartridges, setting off a chain of explosions and killing many of the British. Jones's men began to board the Serapis, and soon it was the British captain who struck his colors. And none too soon, the Bonhomme Richard had fought its last fight and sank into the Atlantic. But with the war over, America quickly determined that it could not afford even the remnant of the Navy that had survived. It was disbanded in 1790, leaving only a small force of revenue cutters, the predecessor to the U.S. Coast Guard, to patrol the coast. As a result, U.S. merchant ships now had almost no protection from pirates. Prior to the Declaration of Independence, American merchant ships were protected from pirates both by the Royal Navy and by British treaties with North African states. But soon after the war, pirates from the Barbary Coast began taking American ships. In 1784, Moroccan pirates captured an American merchant vessel. Algerian pirates captured more in 1785, and then continued over the next decade. America began paying tribute to the pirates. Congress reacted with the Naval Act of 1794, which authorized the building of 6 frigates, 4 with 44 guns, and 2 with 36 guns. The original 6 frigates of the new United States Navy were the USS United States, the President, the Constellation, the Chesapeake, the Congress, and the Constitution. Designed by Joshua Humphreys, the USS Constellation was the first U.S. Navy vessel put out to sea, and also the first to defeat an enemy ship. Humphreys designed the Constellation to be stronger than other frigate-class ships, but faster than the more powerful ships of the line. She was 164 feet in length with a 13.5-foot draft and carried 38 24-pounder guns. Another incentive for the Americans to take more deliberate steps in developing their military was the increased tension with France in the mid to late 1790s. While America had been busy creating a government of, by, and for the people, France went through a revolution of its own. And as American relations with Britain improved, its relations with now revolutionary France soured. Britain was again engaged in hostilities with France. The French were angered by America's apparent siding with Britain and attacked American merchant vessels. In 1798, Congress created the Navy Department to provide organizational structure to the service, and the U.S. Marine Corps to add to the nation's defense. The Navy sailed with dozens of ships, augmented by hundreds of privateers. The U.S. force performed well, capturing French ships and freeing some captured American merchant ships. In the new Navy's first major triumph, the USS Constellation captured the French frigate L'Insurgente, a fast 40-gun ship, on February 9, 1799. The prospect of America allying with Britain was enough to calm tensions and bring the parties to the negotiating table. War was averted, though not in time to save Adams from losing the 1800 election to Jefferson. And then it was time to deal with the pirates. For years, America had been paying tribute to pirates along the Barbary Coast. But when Jefferson became president, he refused to pay any more. The nation was behind him with the battle cry, "Millions for defense, but not a penny for tribute," quoting South Carolina Representative Robert Goodloe Harper, who had spoken in regard to the quasi-war with France. But the convictions behind his words seemed all the more valid when the enemies were pirates. In response, the Pasha of Tripoli, in present-day Libya, declared war on the United States. President Jefferson sent a small naval force to the North African coast to deal with the pirates. The American ships were initially successful, but in 1803, the frigate USS Philadelphia ran aground on an uncharted reef off of Tripoli harbor. The ship was captured, and her officers and men were held hostage by the Pasha. The loss of the frigate Philadelphia was bad, but the prospect of its use by the enemy was worse. The Americans couldn't leave the Philadelphia to the Tripolitans. If it couldn't be captured, it would have to be destroyed. 25-year-old Navy Lieutenant Stephen Decatur led a small group of volunteers into Tripoli harbor, sneaking in under the cover of night in a captured Tripolitan ketch or fishing boat. Yale American history professor Charles Henry Smith described Decatur's daring mission.
The little ketch, now named the Intrepid, with a company of 75 picked men on board, entered the harbor of Tripoli on the night of February 16, 1804, and, favored by the darkness and by the very boldness of the undertaking, which was enough to disarm suspicion, reached the side of the Philadelphia. Then the alarm of the Americanos was raised, and at the same instant Decatur sprang on board, followed by his company. The Philadelphia was fully manned by Tripolitans, and these came rushing up on deck from below. But nothing could resist the impetuosity of Decatur's attack, and in 10 minutes, he had swept the enemy off into the water and was in complete control of the ship.
But now, the mission became even more hazardous. The Tripolitans, anticipating a possible attempt to destroy the Philadelphia, had positioned it within range of over 100 heavy guns on shore and 24 armed ships within the harbor.
The noise of the conflict on the Philadelphia had of course given the alarm, so that not a moment was to be lost. Quickly the men sprang to the different parts of the ship which they had been detailed to set on fire, and so thoroughly and rapidly was the work done that some of the firing parties had barely time to reach the deck before being overtaken by flame and smoke. All was done with coolness and precision, even the rescuing of a wounded pirate who could not escape unaided from the flames. Back on the Intrepid, it remained to get her out, a very different matter from getting her in. The burning ship lighted up the whole scene, and the retreating boat received the concentrated fire of the batteries and the ships. Slowly making her way out, she escaped as if by miracle, and when out of range, Decatur mustered his men and found that not one was lost, and only one was slightly wounded.
Decatur's capture and destruction of the Philadelphia made him a hero both at home and abroad. The great British Vice Admiral, Lord Horatio Nelson, called it the most bold and daring act of the age. Decatur was soon promoted to captain and was later given command of the naval yard at Gosport, which today is the Norfolk Naval Shipyard. And a few years later, he commanded the 44-gun frigate, the USS United States, in the War of 1812. Britain and France were again at war, and America was insisting that it was a neutral party. But Britain imposed trade restrictions between America and France, which was both a hardship and an insult to American sovereignty. Furthermore, Britain had captured British-born Americans off of merchant sailing vessels and impressed them into service in the Royal Navy. Add to that Britain's continued support of the Indian tribes in the Northwest Territory, providing arms to Indians who then raided American settlements, and finally, in 1812, America could take no more. On June 18th, 1812, Congress declared war on Great Britain. Less than a month later, the frigate USS Constitution, one of the original 6 frigates of the U.S. Navy, ran into a squadron of British ships off the coast of New Jersey. The Constitution's captain, Isaac Hull, wrote to Secretary of Navy Paul Hamilton describing the encounter and the dramatic 3-day chase.
At daylight, or a little before it was quite light, I saw one frigate astern within about 5 or 6 miles, and a line of battleship, a frigate, a brig, and schooner, about 10 or 12 miles directly astern, all in chase of us, with a fine breeze, and coming up very fast, it being nearly calm where we were. Soon after sunrise, the wind entirely left us, and the ship would not steer. It soon appeared that we must be taken, and that our escape was impossible. 4 heavy ships nearly within gunshot, and coming up fast, and not the least hope of a breeze, to give us a chance of getting off by outsailing them.
The enemy ships were being towed by 6 or 8 boats each, with all oars in the water, so that they moved quickly, even without a breeze. With no wind to move his own ship, Hull, at the suggestion of his lieutenant, Charles Morris, used a technique called catching, or warping, to maneuver his ship. He sent boats out ahead of his ship with ropes hundreds of fathoms long, tied to light anchors. When the anchors dropped, the ropes pulled the Constitution forward and away from the enemy. But the enemy was soon using that same trick, and the Constitution struggled to remain out of gunshot of the larger squadron. Finally, after 3 days, the Constitution was able to escape. Then, a month later, the Constitution met again with one of its pursuers, the HMS Guerrière. Stephen Decatur, hero of the wars in Tripoli, proved himself again during the War of 1812. It was while he was commanding the frigate USS United States on October 25, 1812. Charles Morris described the event.
Captain Stephen Decatur, while cruising between the Azores and the Canaries, met the British frigate Macedonian. It will suffice to say of this conflict that after an hour's fight, the Macedonian was a helpless wreck. while the United States showed little injury from the battle. She had lost but 11 men in killed and wounded, while the Macedonian had lost more than 100 of her crew. The result, as before, appears to have been due to the comparative skill in gunnery, the hull of the British ship being pierced by more than 100 shots, while the American ship received but 3 in return.
The HMS Macedonian surrendered and subsequently became the USS Macedonian. Captain Decatur sent a crew to repair the damage, which took 2 weeks. He then brought the prize ship back home, again becoming a national sensation. Lieutenant Morris also described a later triumph in the war that was followed by a brave defeat. Captain James Lawrence, who had been one of the volunteers who followed Stephen Decatur in the burning of the Philadelphia, was commanding the sloop USS Hornet.
On February 24, 1813, the sloop of war Hornet encountered the brig Peacock off the mouth of the Demerara River, South America. The vessels were not unfairly matched in size and armament, yet so swift and sure was the Yankee fire that in 14 minutes the Peacock's flag came down, her hull being so riddled that before all the crew could be taken off, she sank.
In recognition of his victory, Captain Lawrence was given command of the frigate USS Chesapeake. Teddy Roosevelt, who served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy before becoming President, wrote of how the Chesapeake changed hands. It provides an interesting view of how a ship was crewed in the Navy of 1812.
It was very hard to get sailors, most of the men preferring to ship in some of the numerous privateers where the discipline was less strict and the chance of prize money much greater. A few of the Constitution's old crew came aboard, and these, together with some of the men who had been on the Chesapeake during her former voyage, made an excellent nucleus. Such men needed very little training at either guns or sails, but the new hands were unpracticed and came on board so late that the last draft that arrived still had their hammocks and bags lying in the boats, stowed over the booms when the ship was captured.
So with his unseasoned crew, Lawrence set sail from Boston Harbor. The British frigate Shannon, under the command of British Captain Philip Broke, was patrolling the harbor. Captain Broke was eager to strike an American frigate to respond to the humiliating losses the British had taken so far. Teddy Roosevelt summed it all up.
The lessons taught by all this were the usual ones. Lawrence's victory in the Hornet showed the superiority of a properly trained crew to one that had not been properly trained. And his defeat in the Chesapeake pointed exactly the same way, demonstrating in addition the folly of taking a raw levy out of port.
Lawrence's death hit one of his fellow captains particularly hard. Captain Oliver Hazard Perry named his new ship in memory of his friend, the USS Lawrence. And he took as his battle flag Lawrence's dying words, "Don't give up the ship." On September 10th, 1813, Perry commanded a successful fleet action against a British squadron of ships on Lake Erie. The War of 1812 continued on through 1813 and 1814. Along the way, Washington, D.C., including the White House and Capitol building, was burned in August 1814. And then, in September, Baltimore faced invasion as British warships tried to enter the harbor. For 25 hours, the British ships rained continuous fire on Fort McHenry, attempting to pass it and penetrate into the harbor. But they failed to pass the fort and succeeded instead in inspiring Francis Scott Key to write the poem The Defense of Fort McHenry, which would eventually become the Star-Spangled Banner. But finally, both sides grew tired of the costly but unproductive war. On Christmas Eve, 1814, the two sides signed the Treaty of Ghent, ending the conflict. But the war had demonstrated the value of a strong navy, with captains like Decatur and Perry and others becoming national heroes. The war inspired some to a push for a naval academy, similar to the U.S. Military Academy at West Point. But it was decades before Navy Secretary George Bancroft was able to secure congressional funding for the school in Annapolis, Maryland. The Naval School, with a class of 50, opened in 1845. In 1850, it was renamed the United States Naval Academy. Around this time, in 1846 to 48, the United States was at war with Mexico. The Navy played a key role in two major actions during the war, helping to secure U.S. victory. In 1846, the U.S. Navy's Pacific Squadron, under Commodore Robert Stockton, helped facilitate the capture of California. And in 1847, the U.S. Navy and Army conducted a joint operation, the first large-scale amphibious assault conducted by the U.S. military. The naval force was commanded during the landing by Captain Matthew C. Perry, younger brother to Oliver Perry. Charles Morris described the assault.
In March 1847, a fleet of 70 ships and transports was gathered before this port, conveying the 12,600 men of General Winfield Scott's Army of Invasion. It was decided to make the attack by a combined land and naval force, and land batteries were planted which began the bombardment on March 22, 1847. On March 25, the bombardment of Veracruz ceased at the request of the Mexicans. 3 days afterwards, the city was surrendered.
The war with Mexico would soon end, and as Charles Morris notes,
not many years afterwards, Commodore Perry performed an important work not only for the United States but for the civilized world in the opening of Japan to commerce and friendly intercourse. For several centuries, the island empire of Japan, incensed at the behavior of its first Christian visitors, had closed its ports to the world and remained persistently isolated. After the beginning of the 19th century, several efforts were made by European nations, and particularly by Russia, to put an end to this policy of isolation, but in vain. Commodore Perry succeeded this mission in 1852 and reached Japan in the following year with the steamers Mississippi and Susquehanna and the sailing ships Saratoga and Plymouth. The wall of Japanese isolation thus broken down, all attempts at seclusion were soon given up. The work of Commodore Perry has proved of more advantage to Japan than to any other nation, since that country has emerged from the position of an empire absolutely without influence in the councils of the nations into that of one of the leading powers of the world.
Perry succeeded in his mission to Japan, despite the loss of what had been considered by many an essential tool for maintaining discipline on a ship: flogging offenders with the cat-o'-nine-tails. The cat was made of 9 pieces of cord, with 3 knots tied into the end of each, all tied to a short wooden handle. The captain could order offenders flogged with this upon their bare backs. There were reports of sailors receiving 12 lashes for offenses as minor as spilling ink. In 1850, Congress outlawed flogging. Not surprisingly, many old hands were not happy. An anonymous naval officer wrote an article he titled, "A Plea in Favor of Maintaining Flogging in the Navy."
To prepare ships of war for the services that may be desired of them at any moment, they are carefully provided with heavy armaments, comprising the most improved inventions for the wholesale destruction of human life. And they are thronged with men who are more zealously taught to wield these instruments of death than they ever were to fear God and obey His commandments. And there is always in every ship a knot of abandoned and incorrigible vagabonds, sweepings of the jails and streets, the outcasts of the shore, who herd with the vicious portion of the seamen and form a turbulent and unruly gang, setting at defiance all moderate attempts to govern them, and having the fixed purpose of shirking duty and overturning decency, order, and law on board. The laws for the government of men thus banded together for the purpose of war are necessarily arbitrary and severe. The crew cannot be governed like any civil body because there is not nor can there be any parallel between their different condition.
This concern was felt by far more than this anonymous officer. And during the first few years after flogging was outlawed, reports of insubordination increased as officers sought new and more inventive ways to punish offenders. But Commodore Perry, knowing he had a long journey with few ports of call, chose instead to improve discipline by improving morale. He increased rations, encouraged visits between ships, and even theatrical productions to entertain the crew. His trip was a great success, which would have been impossible with an unruly crew. Perry proved that discipline did not require excessively harsh sanctions. But the Navy's great successes with regard to foreign interests, like Japan and Mexico, were not enough to prevent the United States from being ripped apart by domestic strife. When people think of the Civil War, they generally imagine the great armies of the Union and Confederacy blasting away at each other with cannon and rifle. But the navies played a critical part in the war. Indeed, the ships created for this war and the battles between them would change naval warfare forever. In fact, the battle that began the war involved control of a major harbor. 6 days after South Carolina seceded, and under the cover of darkness, Major Robert Anderson moved his regiment out of the indefensible federal Fort Moultrie and into Fort Sumter. Both forts were in South Carolina's Charleston Harbor, but Sumter, still under construction and previously unoccupied, controlled the entrance to the harbor. Anderson was in a better position, but he and his 85 men needed supplies, arms, and reinforcements. President Buchanan ordered civilian merchant vessel the Star of the West to be used to make the delivery, hoping it would be seen as less antagonistic to the Confederates. But as the Star of the West approached Sumter on January 9, 1861, cadets from the Citadel, who were manning the artillery battery on Morris Island, opened fire. Batteries from the now Confederate-held Fort Moultrie joined in, and the ship was forced to withdraw. Months later, South Carolina forces would open fire on Fort Sumter, capturing the fort and beginning the war. In the early days of the war, Union General-in-Chief Winfield Scott proposed a naval blockade as a means of subduing the South. His Anaconda Plan, as it became known, involved using the Union Navy to cut the Confederacy off from the rest of the world. While the plan was not enacted precisely as proposed, the Union Navy would maintain a blockade of the Confederate ports throughout the war, and the Confederate Navy, once it came into existence, would work to help smugglers run the blockade and bring supplies to the southern states. The two most famous ships of the Civil War were the USS Monitor and the CSS Virginia. This was the first meeting of ironclad warships, and the whole world took notice. On the first day of the battle, the Virginia, which had been built from the remains of the U.S. wooden warship, the Merrimac, sank 2 wooden Union ships and crippled a third. On the second day, March 9, 1862, the USS Monitor arrived, and the two ironclads hammered at each other, eventually concluding in a draw. Confederate Colonel John Taylor Wood wrote of the reaction to their confrontation, the Battle of Hampton Roads.
The engagement in Hampton Roads was in some respect the most momentous naval conflict ever witnessed. No battle was ever more widely discussed or produced a greater sensation. It revolutionized the navies of the world. Line of battle ships,
those huge overgrown craft carrying from 80 to 120 guns and from 500 to 1,200 men, which from the destruction of the Spanish Armada to our time had done most of the fighting. Decided the fate of empires were at once universally condemned as out of date. Rams and ironclads were in future to decide all naval warfare.
After the Battle of Hampton Roads, both sides built more ironclads. The Union, in particular, was able to build a sizable force of 50 Monitor-class ships. The following month, the Union Navy, with a small contingent of Marines, had a more clear-cut victory with the capture of New Orleans. Charles Morris described the campaign.
An attack on New Orleans was suggested to the Navy Department by Commander David D. Porter, who proposed as leader of the expedition David G. Farragut, midshipman under his father in the old Essex 50 years before. The suggestion was accepted and Farragut appointed flag officer of the fleet, and on February 20, 1862, he reached Ship Island near the mouth of the Great River of the West. Beginning April 18, for 6 days the mortar boats kept up a steady fire, while on the 20th, Lieutenant Caldwell in the gunboat Itasca made a dash upon the river chain, which he succeeded in breaking. At 2 o'clock on the morning of the 24th of April, the advance up the river began. The mortar boats poured shells into Fort Jackson in a steady stream. The fight with the Confederate vessels was more severe than that with the forts. The Cayuga, the first to encounter them, was soon reinforced by others, and for some time a brisk battle went on. The Louisiana proved of little service, and the Manassas, after a vigorous effort to ram some of the Union ships, was run ashore and abandoned by her crew. The battle ended in the flight of the unhurt Confederate craft, the Union fleet following triumphantly up the stream and reaching the levees of New Orleans at 1 o'clock in the afternoon of April 25.
Farragut demanded the surrender of New Orleans. The city rejected his demand at first, but finally did surrender on April 28th. The capture of New Orleans was a resounding victory, for which Congress honored Farragut by promoting him to Rear Admiral. Farragut is perhaps a bit more famous, however, for his words at the Battle of Mobile Bay. Historian Mabel Beebe wrote of the action at Mobile Bay in August 1864.
A double line of torpedoes, or submarine mines, was stretched across the channel. Above this lay the Confederate fleet. One of these vessels, the Tennessee, was a huge iron ram-like, the Merrimac. The squadron of Admiral Farragut was a strong one. There were 24 wooden war vessels and 4 ironclads, like the Monitor. The 4 ironclads were sent ahead close to the forts. The wooden war vessels followed, lashed together in pairs. This was done so that if one vessel became disabled, it could be towed by the other. Farragut wished to lead the fleet in his flagship, the Hartford, but his officers dissuaded him, and the Brooklyn went first. The Hartford followed.
During the battle, Admiral Farragut climbed high up into the rigging so that he could see past the blinding smoke. Fearing that the Admiral might fall from the height, one of his men eventually had to tie Farragut to the rigging.
The ironclad Tecumseh was now leading the fleet. Suddenly there was a muffled explosion. The stern of the Tecumseh rose out of the water and she plunged bow foremost to the bottom of the channel. This was a critical moment of the battle. The backing of the Brooklyn caused confusion among the vessels following so closely upon each other. There was tremendous cheering and firing from the Confederates. They were sure that the victory was theirs.
Farragut was unwilling to give them that victory. Famously, he called out, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" Despite these great naval battles, most of the water-based combat of the Civil War was not on the open seas, but along the nation's vast network of rivers. The so-called Brown Water Navy of Union riverboats drove down the Mississippi River, capturing major cities and forts. When they captured Vicksburg and Port Hudson, they had complete command of the Mississippi, cutting the Confederacy in half. Union Rear Admiral Henry Walk wrote of the gunboats that the Union used so effectively.
During the spring and summer of 1861, Commander John Rodgers purchased, altered, equipped, and manned, for immediate service on the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, 3 wooden gunboats: the Tyler, of 6 8-inch shell guns and 2 32-pounders, the Lexington, of 4 8-inch shell guns and 2 32-pounders, and the Conestoga, of 4 32-pounder guns. This nucleus of the Mississippi flotilla was completed with great skill and dispatch. They soon had full possession of the western rivers above Columbus, Kentucky, and rendered more important service than as many regiments could have done. On October 12, 1861, the St. Louis, afterward known as DeKalb, the first of the ironclad gunboats, was launched. The other ironclads were launched soon after. On the evening of the 6th of November, 1861, I received instructions from General Grant to proceed down the Mississippi with the wooden gunboats Tyler and Lexington on a reconnaissance, and as convoy to some half a dozen transport steamers. But I did not know the character of the service expected of me until I anchored for the night, 7 or 8 miles below Cairo. Early the next morning, while the troops were being landed near Belmont, Missouri, I attacked the Confederate batteries as a diversion. Soon after we returned to the landing place, our troops began to appear. The Confederates came en masse through a cornfield and opened with musketry and light artillery upon the transports, which were filled or being filled with our retreating soldiers. A well-directed fire from the gunboats made the enemy fly in the greatest confusion.
The river gunboats provided critical support to troops in the Western Theater throughout the war. During the Civil War, the Navy, which had historically been less racially segregated than the Army, had black sailors in its ranks even before the Emancipation Proclamation. Former slaves and free blacks served with distinction in the Union Navy. Men like Robert Blake. Blake had been a slave in South Carolina until he was freed in 1862 by Union forces. He then volunteered to serve on Navy ships, eventually serving as a steward on the gunboat USS Marblehead. On Christmas Day, 1863, the Marblehead was shelled by Confederate artillery on Johns Island, South Carolina. An explosion knocked Blake to the deck, and when he rose, he saw the powder boy who had been manning a gun had been killed. Although he was not serving in a combat role, Blake took over the powder boy's job, carrying gunpowder boxes to the artillery loaders throughout the battle. For his actions under fire, Robert Blake was awarded the Congressional Medal of Honor. After the Civil War, the Navy was rapidly downsized. David Farragut was made the nation's first full admiral. Before 1862, there was no official rank above captain, despite complaints as far back as John Paul Jones, arguing for the need to clarify the senior-most captains during larger operations. The term admiral seemed to carry a sense of royalty, going back to the days of the Royal Navy, so for decades, Congress refused to create a higher rank. Then, in 1862, with the rapidly growing Navy during the war, Congress finally authorized 9 rear admiral posts. In 1864, David Farragut was made the first vice admiral, a position above rear admiral. And in 1866, Farragut was promoted to full admiral, an American first. Farragut's adoptive brother, David Dixon Porter, was made vice admiral at the same time, filling Farragut's old position. Farragut died in 1870, and Porter eventually became admiral. Porter had been a successful captain and rear admiral during the war. After the war, he was made superintendent of the U.S. Naval Academy, where he instituted a number of reforms, such as the honor system. He also brought organized sports to the Academy, which would eventually lead to an all-new meaning behind the cry, "Go Navy." And the need for improved training was clear, particularly with regard to the advances in weapons technology. But despite the improvements to training and weaponry, the Navy was actually in decline. Exhausted by the Civil War, focused on reconstruction, the nation did not wish to devote resources to its fleet. As a result, by the late 1870s, the U.S. Navy had fallen behind the other nations of the world. Legislation in 1883 authorized the construction of new steel warships. These ships were sometimes called the ABCD ships, named Atlanta, Boston, Chicago, and Dauphin. These ships were hybrids. They were given steel hulls and powerful steam engines, but were also able to run under sail. But eventually the masts and sails were removed, acknowledging the power of the coal-powered steam engines. The new Steel Navy would prove itself in the Spanish-American War. But the war would begin tragically for the Navy with the sinking of the battleship USS Maine. The Maine was in Havana Harbor, sent there to protect U.S. interests during the Cuban Revolt. On February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded without warning, killing most of her crew, 266 men. Though today, it is believed that the explosion was probably caused by spontaneous combustion of coal in the bunker next to the magazine, at the time, it was widely believed that the ship was sunk by a Spanish mine. America was soon at war with Spain. The first battle between U.S. and Spanish forces was at Manila Bay in the Philippines under then Commodore George Dewey on May 1st, 1898. Commodore Dewey had been with David Farragut when the Rear Admiral had exclaimed, "Damn the torpedoes! Full speed ahead!" Dewey followed his old admiral's advice and pressed forward.
Soon, the guns of the batteries in the Spanish fleet began to pour a storm of shot and shell at the American squadron. But, as yet, Commodore Dewey had not fired a gun. Finally, Commodore Dewey said quietly to the captain of the Olympia, "You may fire when ready, Gridley." The flagship was now within range, and suddenly one of the great guns sent an answering shot. As its echoes went rolling across the waters, every man in the American fleet joined in the shout, "Remember the Maine!" These words were the battle cry at Manila Bay. Slowly, the American vessels steamed by the Spanish squadron in single file, pouring in deadly broadsides as they passed. The marksmanship of the Americans was wonderful, and at the end of 2 hours, nearly every ship in the Spanish fleet had either been sunk or was on fire.
Dewey's Asiatic Squadron had captured Manila Bay with only 9 of his own men wounded and none killed. One of the heroes of the Spanish-American War was Teddy Roosevelt, the former Assistant Secretary of the Navy. A few years later, he was President of the United States, and he was quite willing to demonstrate to the world America's new, strong Navy. When he advised, "Speak softly and carry a big stick. You will go far," the stick he had in mind was the U.S. Navy. In 1907, President Roosevelt sent 16 naval battleships on a mission to circumnavigate the globe. The ships, painted white to demonstrate America's commitment to peace through strength, became known as the Great White Fleet. These were all modern ships of the Steel Navy, built since the end of the Spanish-American War. They sailed out in 4 squadrons, manned by 14,000 sailors and Marines, and commanded by Rear Admiral Charles S. Sperry. They would visit 20 port of calls on 6 continents on a 14-month cruise covering over 43,000 miles. The primary purpose was to impress upon Japan the ability of the U.S. Navy to pivot from the Atlantic to the Pacific. Tensions were running high at the time. Roosevelt wanted to avoid a war and believed the Imperial Japanese government needed to see America's strength to be dissuaded from taking aggressive actions. The fleet left Hampton Roads, Virginia on December 16, 1907, and reached San Francisco on May 8, 1908. Along the way, they stopped in Trinidad, Brazil, Chile, Peru, and Mexico. At the time, most people thought that the expedition would end there, with the fleet having reached the Pacific in excellent time, in first-class shape. But the fleet continued, visiting Honolulu, New Zealand, Australia, Japan, China, the Philippines, Sri Lanka, Egypt, Gibraltar, and then back to Hampton Roads on February 22, 1909. The trip was successful in its goal of easing tensions with Japan. That visit had gone extremely well, thanks in large part to Admiral Perry's diplomatic skill. It also demonstrated the capabilities of the Navy, which made the journey without serious incident. And it succeeded in raising the morale of the nation. But the trip also gave the Navy information about design defects and areas of improvement. And it demonstrated the need for bases overseas for refueling and supply. These lessons would strengthen the Navy even further, and at just the right time. For in less than a decade, American sailors, soldiers, and Marines would cross the Atlantic en route to World War I. In less than a century and a half, America's Navy went from non-existent to one of the greatest sea powers in the world. But the growing power of America's Navy was only just beginning. And America's sailors would continue to prove the truth of George Washington's words that with a decisive naval force, America can do everything honorable and glorious. In every corner of the globe, and located in any of the 7 oceans of our world, you will find representatives from the United States Navy. Recurrent in the history of the United States Navy are attempts to dismantle and discard the wrongly maligned seagoing force, from the disbandment of the Navy after the American Revolution to efforts after World War II, when a few short-sighted individuals thought that armed conflict could be resolved by an airplane or a single bomb alone. In the last 2 centuries, the United States Navy has more than proven its worth and secured its place among our armed forces. And its place is everywhere and anywhere. As President Bill Clinton once said,
"The word of crisis breaks out in Washington. It's no accident that the first question that comes to everyone's lips is, where is the dearest Harry?"
Using the most advanced technology and maintaining a presence as a first responder to natural disasters and a first line of defense should any nation seek to attack the United States or any of her allies, is the mission of the United States Navy. Join us in our continued look at the history, battles, and the men and women of the United States Navy.
A good navy is not a provocation to war. It is the surest guarantee of peace.
Notice, travelers intending to embark on the Atlantic voyage are reminded that a state of war exists between Germany and her allies, and Great Britain and her allies, that the zone of war includes the waters adjacent to the British Isles, that, in accordance with formal notice given by the Imperial German government, vessels flying the flag of Great Britain or any of her allies are liable to destruction in those waters, and that travelers sailing in the war zone on the ships of Great Britain or her allies do so at their own risk. Imperial German Embassy, Washington, D.C., 22nd April, 1915.
In April of 1915, German submarine forces, known to most of the world as U-boats, had begun in earnest a trade blockade of the United Kingdom and other allies in Europe. This essentially meant that German submarine crews assumed that any ships passing through or near the area of blockade would be a threat, either directly as warships or indirectly through secretly stowing military ordnance or other supplies. The ocean liner RMS Lusitania had operated for the Cunard Line since 1907. At the outbreak of World War I, she took precautions to avoid enemy ships, such as painting the hull a slate gray, but still operated as a passenger liner. By the time of German exclusion, Lusitania had returned to civilian colors and was no longer as cautious as she had been at the outbreak of the hostilities. Indeed, the Lusitania's patronage had dwindled somewhat, and in spite of warnings placed in New York newspapers by the German embassy in the weeks before launch, on May 1st, 1915, with nearly 2,000 passengers and crew, the ocean liner set sail from New York City en route to Liverpool, the ship's home port. 7 days later, the ship was identified and shot by torpedoes from the German U-boat U-20. The liner sank in 20 minutes, 11 miles off the old head of Kinsale, Ireland. The Lusitania was not equipped with enough lifeboats for the scrambling passengers and crew, and the attack killed 1,198 people, including many American citizens. The attack would prove instrumental in the decision at long last for the United States of America to enter into World War I. In 1913, President Woodrow Wilson assigned future President Franklin Delano Roosevelt to serve as Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Secretary of the Navy Josephus Daniels. Daniels himself was an ardent supporter of the Navy, and measures taken by Daniels, such as barring liquor from Navy ships and forbidding prostitution within 5 miles of any Navy installation, served to create a strong and efficient fighting force. Roosevelt backed these measures wholeheartedly and was just as adamant in his negotiations with Congress and other government departments when it came to budgets and with shipbuilders and other contractors that sought to undermine Union shipbuilders. During FDR's time as Assistant Secretary, not a single shipbuilder's strike occurred. Roosevelt's measures helped expand the Navy exponentially, including the founding and development of the United States Navy Reserve, as well as acting as an early proponent of submarine warfare to combat the German U-boat fleet. Shortly before the sinking of the Lusitania, when it had become clear that Germany was engaged in all-out submarine war, Roosevelt urged President Wilson to allow the Navy to outfit for war. Wilson refused. By the following year, the United States Navy had been mobilized into action on the seas surrounding the United Kingdom. As World War I drew to a close, Roosevelt oversaw the demobilization effort, but outright opposed the emerging ideas about dismantling the Navy altogether. Roosevelt later said,
"Our security is not a matter of weapons alone. The arm that wields them must be strong, the eye that guides them clear, the will that directs them indomitable."
Germany's fleet of U-boats numbered only 29. However, in the beginning 10 weeks of World War I, the submarine force had sunk or disabled 5 British cruisers. The Germans practiced unrestricted warfare, meaning that their torpedoes fired indiscriminately at merchant and passenger ships, as well as military vessels. President Wilson repeatedly warned and scolded the Germans, who ignored the president's threat of United States entry into the war. Finally, on November 17, 1917, the United States Navy destroyers, the U.S. Fanning and the USS Nicholson, became involved in the first victory over the U-boats. The German sub U-58 moved to attack the British merchant ship SS Welshman when the Fanning and Nicholson dropped depth charges and opened fire on the U-boat when she surfaced. The battle ended in German surrender. It would be the first of only a handful of victories over the nigh unstoppable enemy subs in World War I. After the Continental Navy was disbanded in 1790, the United States Revenue Cutter Service was formed. For the 8 years that the United States operated without a navy, the cutters were the only seagoing armed force in operation. Founded by then Treasury Secretary Alexander Hamilton, revenue cutters saw action in the quasi-war with France, as well as in the War of 1812, alongside the recently formed United States Navy. In 1848, a combination of state and local humanitarian efforts led to the formation of the United States Life-Saving Service. Its mission was the search and rescue of shipwrecked merchant seamen and passengers, aiding in natural disasters such as the Great Carolina Hurricane of 1854. In 1915, these two services officially merged to form the United States Coast Guard. It was from the Life-Saving Service's 1899 Regulation Manual that the Coast Guard's unofficial motto came: "You have to go out, but you don't have to come back." The manual outlined the never give up, never say die attitude that must be the way of life for all who serve in the Coast Guard.
In attempting a rescue, the keeper will select either the boat, breeches buoy, or life car, as in his judgment is best suited to effectively cope with the existing conditions. If the device first selected fails after such trial as satisfies him that no further attempt with it is feasible, he will resort to one of the others, and if that fails, then to the remaining one, and he will not desist from his efforts until by actual trial the impossibility of effecting a rescue is demonstrated. The statement of the keeper that he did not try to use the boat because the sea or surf was too heavy will not be accepted unless attempts to launch it were actually made and failed, or unless the conformation of the coast, as bluffs, precipitous banks, etc., is such as to unquestionably preclude the use of a boat.
The Coast Guard began to prepare for World War I prior to the official U.S. declaration of war on April 6, 1917. The year prior was spent updating telephone and telegraph communications and improving upon lighthouses and aid and rescue stations. After the official declaration came, the Coast Guard was placed under the operational control of the U.S. Navy, with the Coast Guard's 4,000 officers and men and 44 vessels working in tandem with the Navy in search and rescue, as well as combat operations during the Great War. During the War of 1812, the United States Navy suffered from an enormous lack of enlisted men. As such, they placed no restriction on the enlistment of black men during that time, and it soon came to be that 25% of the squadrons fighting at the Battle of Lake Erie were African Americans. During the Mexican War, African American men served on the USS Treasure and the USS Columbus, and during the Civil War, more than 100,000 of these former slaves served as part of the Union Navy. However, the employment of black men in the Navy was abruptly curtailed after 1900. Paralleling the rise of Jim Crow and legalized segregation in much of America was the cutback in the number of black sailors, who by 1909 were mostly in the galley and the engine room.
It is hereby declared to be the policy of the President that there shall be equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin.
On July 26, 1948, President Harry S. Truman issued Executive Order 9981, abolishing segregation in the military. The United States Navy had a varying history with enlisted black men, dating back to the War of 1812 and the Spanish-American War, where the fleets were made up of anywhere from 20 to 40% African Americans, to World War I, where black men were almost excluded from enlistment altogether. Serving in only such roles as mess duty and coal passing, they made up only around 1% of the Navy's enlistment. After the Great War, from 1922 through 1932, policy prohibited African Americans from enlisting at all. With Truman's order, segregated fleets and units were to be a thing of the past, although the last all-black unit saw combat in Korea in 1950. After the attack on Pearl Harbor during World War II, Dory Miller became the first African American to be honored with the Navy Cross for his actions during the attack. A cook, third class, Miller operated a machine gun on the deck of the USS West Virginia. Miller had no training on the weapon, but held off enemy fire and is credited with shooting down at least one Japanese fighter plane.
For distinguished devotion to duty, extraordinary courage, and disregard for his own personal safety during the attack on the fleet in Pearl Harbor, territory of Hawaii, by Japanese forces on December 7, 1941. While at the side of his captain on the bridge, Miller, despite enemy strafing and bombing, and in the face of a serious fire, assisted in moving his captain, who had been mortally wounded, to a place of greater safety, and later manned and operated a machine gun directed at enemy Japanese attacking aircraft until ordered to leave the bridge.
Should hostilities once break out between Japan and the United States, it would not be enough that we take Guam and the Philippines, nor even Hawaii and San Francisco. To make victory certain, we would have to march into Washington, D.C. and dictate the terms of peace in the White House. I wonder if our politicians, who speak so lightly of a Japanese-American war, have confidence as to the final outcome and are prepared to make the necessary sacrifices.
In 5 hours on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese sank or severely damaged 8 battleships, 10 smaller warships, and over 200 American aircraft. 24,000 U.S. soldiers and sailors lost their lives in what was essentially a surprise attack. There was no formal declaration of war, but sure enough, the attack itself, one of the worst defeats in U.S. naval history, brought the United States Armed Forces into World War II. 10 days after the Pearl Harbor attacks, the U.S. Pacific Fleet received a new commander-in-chief, Admiral Chester Nimitz. His swearing-in ceremony was on the deck of the submarine USS Grayling. Protocol dictated that this ceremony take place on board a battleship. However, all available battleships stationed at Pearl Harbor had been sunk or badly damaged. Nimitz, who had commanded battleships, cruisers, and destroyers between the wars, and served on destroyers in World War I, was quick to mobilize Navy forces in an effort to drive the Japanese from their recently occupied territories in the Pacific. In spite of the devastating loss of vessels, supplies, and manpower, Nimitz was able to use all available forces to halt the Japanese advance in the Pacific. As more men and warships became available, the fleet commander went on the offensive with successful naval campaigns such as the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Solomon Islands campaign, including the Battle of Midway. He led successful amphibious attacks on Japanese stations in Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The latter operation was later called the last great battle of the war. The ferocity of the combat actions left 12,000 Americans dead, but the Japanese lost over 100,000. It was this battle that cemented the Navy's decision not to invade the Japanese mainland, and instead suggest the use of the atomic bomb to incur Japan's surrender. When the Japanese officially surrendered on September 2nd, 1945, Admiral Chester Nimitz signed the instrument of surrender as the official representative of the United States. President Franklin Roosevelt needed a senior military officer to advise him as the U.S. entered World War II. His choice was Fleet Admiral William Leahy. In the Navy since 1897, Leahy served in the Spanish-American War, as well as the Philippine-American War and the First World War. Leahy had formerly served as governor of Puerto Rico from 1939 through 1940, establishing military bases and initiating various public works projects on the island. He had also served as an ambassador to France shortly after that nation had come under German occupation in 1941, where his job, as Leahy himself put it, was to keep the French on our side insofar as possible. He was recalled to the United States in May of 1942, and 2 months later, he was the highest-ranking member of the United States military, taking orders only from the President. In effect, he was the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. His knowledge of foreign policy was of great use to Admiral Leahy, who became the first naval officer to ever hold a 5-star rank and was a conduit for all major military decisions of World War II. When the atomic bomb was first developed, Leahy strongly opposed its use on the enemy.
Once it had been tested, President Truman faced the decision as to whether to use it. He did not like the idea, but he was persuaded that it would shorten the war against Japan and save American lives. It is my opinion that the use of this barbarous weapon at Hiroshima and Nagasaki was of no material assistance in our war against Japan. The Japanese were already defeated and ready to surrender because of the effective sea blockade and the successful bombing with conventional weapons. My own feeling was that in being the first to use it, we had adopted an ethical standard common to the barbarians of the Dark Ages. I was not taught to make wars in that fashion, and that wars cannot be won by destroying women and children.
6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States Navy entered into 3 days of fighting that would prove pivotal in the Pacific theater of operations. Thanks to American code breakers, the Navy learned the date and location of a planned Imperial Japanese Navy attack on Midway Atoll, located at the northwestern end of Hawaii. Admiral Nimitz mobilized every available aircraft carrier and a total of 41 planes, including Grumman TBF-1 Avengers. The force was enough to surprise the complacent Japanese attackers. The battle at Midway saw 4 Japanese aircraft carriers sunk, as well as a heavy cruiser. The United States Navy lost 1 carrier and 1 destroyer, along with 307 soldiers and sailors. the Japanese lost almost 10 times that number. This decisively defeated the Japanese and served as a tipping point in the favor of U.S. forces in the Pacific.
There are no great men, just great challenges which ordinary men, out of necessity, are forced by circumstances to meet.
A 1904 graduate of the Naval Academy, William Bull Halsey, became one of the few officers to ever be promoted to lieutenant directly from ensign, skipping over the lieutenant junior grade rank entirely. In 1909, Halsey began his career on the USS DuPont, a torpedo boat. Torpedoes and torpedo boats would become a specialty of his, and from 1912 through 1913, he commanded the first group of the Atlantic Fleet's torpedo flotilla. As the Navy evolved, so did Halsey. He began to see the aircraft carrier as a crucial offensive weapons system, rather as a mere defense mechanism to which some would relegate the vessels.
If anything gets in my way, we'll shoot first and argue afterwards.
Halsey was not hesitant to strike, and strike hard. His flagship, the USS Enterprise, was at sea, returning to his home base, Pearl Harbor, when it was attacked on December 7, 1941. Later, his carrier took part in raids on Japanese-controlled islands, as well as the Doolittle raid, which dropped bombs on Japan's mainland in direct response to the Pearl Harbor attack. Illness kept Halsey from commanding his ship at the Battle of Midway, but in October of 1942, Halsey returned to command his ship for the actions at Guadalcanal, where Navy, Air Force, and Marine personnel were able to sink a total of 2 Japanese battleships, 3 destroyers, 11 transports, and downed 64 aircraft, effectively blocking supply routes from Japan that were key in taking the Solomon Islands.
Nauru Island. Commander. Native knows position. He can pilot. 11 alive. Need small boat. Kennedy.
That message was carved on a coconut and was to be the savior of 11 men in the Pacific theater of World War II. On August 2nd, 1943, between Arundel and Kolombangara in the Solomon Islands, the Japanese destroyer ship Amagiri, moving swiftly in the night to avoid United States detection, ran down the motor torpedo boat PT-109. It is unknown whether the destroyer meant this course of action or if they simply did not see the United States Navy vessel in the dark waters. In any event, the crew of PT-109 had only 10 seconds to respond to the impending enemy vessel. 109, as well as PT-162 and PT-169, were patrolling the area in search of enemy ships when the Amagiri surprised them. After the boat struck PT-109, cutting it in half, PT-169 fired upon the Amagiri, missing it. Assuming the crew of PT-109 lost, 169 and 162 returned to base. In fact, only 2 crew members aboard PT-109 were killed. The rest were led to the safety of a nearby island by their commander, a Harvard varsity swim team alumnus, Lieutenant, junior grade, John F. Kennedy. The crew placed their shoes and non-swimmers on a timber used as a gun mount and kicked their feet for 4 hours, landing 3.5 miles away on the deserted Plum Pudding Island, one of the few islands in the area not home to a Japanese installation. When the island was found to be without food or drinkable water, Kennedy then swam another 2 miles to find a habitable island. After relocating to a nearby island with fresh water and coconuts for food, the men were discovered by 2 natives who had been dispatched by an Australian coast watcher. Kennedy then carved his message on a coconut shell and sent the natives to the nearest U.S. Navy base at Rendova, and the PT-157 rescued Kennedy's beleaguered crew.
I can imagine no more rewarding a career, and any man who may be asked in this century what he did to make his life worthwhile, I think, can respond with a good deal of pride and satisfaction. I served in the United States Navy.
Like many Americans, the attack on Pearl Harbor inspired George Herbert Walker Bush to enlist in the United States military. He became a naval aviator at 18 as part of the U.S. Navy Reserve, at the time the youngest aviator in Navy history. As a part of the torpedo squadron VT-51, his lanky physique earned him the nickname Skin, and his unit was victorious in one of the largest air battles of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. On August 1st, 1944, Bush was promoted to lieutenant, junior grade, and was stationed on the carrier USS San Jacinto. As his squadron commenced attacks on Japanese installations on Chichijima in the Bonin Islands, Bush's Grumman TBM Avenger aircraft was shot. And even though one of the engines caught fire, Bush and his crew completed the mission, releasing bombs over their targets. Bush was forced to bail out of the Avenger, and the other 3 crew members were lost. He survived in an inflatable raft for 4 hours, with Japanese fighters flying overhead, until his rescue by the USS Finback. This mission earned him the Distinguished Flying Cross. For heroism and extraordinary achievement in aerial flight as pilot of a torpedo plane in Torpedo Squadron 51, attached to the USS San Jacinto in action against enemy Japanese forces in the vicinity of the Bonin Islands on September 2nd, 1944. Leading one section of a 4-plane division in a strike against a radio station, Lieutenant Junior Grade Bush pressed home an attack in the face of intense anti-aircraft fire. Although his plane was hit and set afire at the beginning of his dive, he continued his plunge toward the target and succeeded in scoring damaging bomb hits before bailing out of the craft. His courage and devotion to duty were in keeping with the highest traditions of the United States Naval Reserve.
To the superb officers and men on land, on sea, in the air, and undersea who have performed such magnificent feats for our country in the past few days. You have written your names in golden letters on the pages of history and won the undying gratitude of your countrymen. My pride in you is beyond expression. No honor for you could be too great. Magnificently done. God bless each and every one of you. To the glorious dead hail heroes, rest with God.
During World War I, the United States Navy became the first branch of the American military to allow women to enlist in a non-nursing capacity. Yeomen, or yeomanettes, served largely in clerical capacities. However, many enlisted women went on to become radio operators, electricians, draftsmen, pharmacists, photographers, telegraphers, fingerprint experts, chemists, torpedo assemblers, and camouflage designers. World War II also saw a need for expanded personnel, this time recruiting women into a special auxiliary. Women appointed for voluntary emergency service, or WAVES, serving on the continental United States and Hawaii. After both World War I and II, U.S. Navy enlisted women were either discharged or, less commonly, held in reserve status. However, with the passage of the Women's Armed Services Integration Act of 1948, women were made a permanent part of the United States Armed Forces. reservist, and inactive duty women were called back into duty, along with the men, for service in Korea in 1950. Today, women can enlist and apply for any job in the Navy, except for Navy SEAL units. And in 2012, the first women sailors began serving on ballistic and cruise missile nuclear submarines. Today, the United States Navy employs a wide range of the most technologically advanced ships on the water. Aircraft carriers and amphibious assault ships and transport docks place most nations within striking distance of U.S. air and marine forces, and as such are essential in forward deployment and deterrence strategies. Cruisers, destroyers, and combat ships are equipped with guided missiles and anti-air and anti-submarine missiles, while frigates, patrol ships, and mine countermeasure ships provide protection for both Navy and merchant ships moving through hostile waters. Modern aircraft carriers and submarines are powered by nuclear reactors. All of the U.S. Navy's battleships and submarines in operation today are nuclear powered. The submarines in the Los Angeles, Seawolf, and Virginia class are attack submarines used in specific tactical missions, including war or defense. The Ohio class, however, act as ballistic submarines with the sole purpose of nuclear deterrence. Ballistic subs are capable of serving as a hidden launching platform for intercontinental ballistic missiles. The end of World War II saw the scrapping and mothballing of many of the United States Navy ships, and by 1948, there remained just over 250 vessels in service. This large-scale decommissioning of ships ended with the rising tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union. While the Korean War brought these tensions to a head, the U.S. Navy did not often have direct involvement in the conflicts that took place. Instead, the Navy assisted with large-scale landings at Incheon, where Navy and Marine Corps amphibious forces succeeded in driving back North Korean forces, and at the Battle of Chosin Reservoir, where the evacuation of over 100,000 UN troops required U.S. Navy assistance. Korea made it clear to the United States government that our Navy would have to be ever ready to react to threats. Especially during the Cold War, where all eyes were on the Soviets, the United States Navy needed to be ready to respond in the event of aggressive communist threats. Fleets of ships were assigned to every corner of the globe, and as the ships were dispatched, Navy scientists and technicians developed new technologies in communications and defense, as well as new missiles and jet-propelled aircraft. Under the guidance of Admiral Hyman Rickover, the Navy received its first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Enterprise. Rickover was a longtime proponent of the nuclear marine propulsion program. However, he regarded nuclear power and the atomic bomb as necessary evils. On May 5th, 1961, a Redstone rocket launched the first American to travel in space, Alan Shepard. Shepard was a graduate of the United States Naval Academy and the U.S. Naval Test Pilot School. He had served on the destroyer USS Cogswell in the Pacific during World War II and was one of 110 test pilots selected to volunteer as part of the famous Mercury 7, NASA's first U.S. manned space program. He was the only member of that initial class of astronauts who would walk on the moon. When he commanded the Apollo 14 mission in 1971. Astronaut Jim Lovell was another graduate of the U.S. Naval Academy and was selected as part of the initial group of volunteers. Medical reasons kept Lovell out of the Mercury program, but he was selected in 1962 as part of NASA Astronaut Group 2. Lovell went on to serve in both the Gemini and Apollo programs. He piloted the Gemini 7 and 12, the latter mission flown with Buzz Aldrin. He became one of the first men to travel to the moon on Apollo 9, completing 10 orbits on Christmas Eve, 1968, before returning to the Earth safely 3 days later. Lovell is perhaps best known as the commander of the Apollo 13 mission. When the Odyssey command module that carried Lovell and pilots Jack Swigert and Fred Hayes became crippled due to an oxygen tank explosion, Lovell's leadership brought the crew back to Earth safely after using the lunar module as a kind of lifeboat and manually adjusting the craft's trajectory, only using his wristwatch for timing. The mission had intended to land on the moon. However, in the resulting survival mission, the crew of the Apollo 13 became the record holders for farthest distance ever traveled from the planet Earth. After 2 unsuccessful CIA-led attempts to quash communist leadership in Cuba, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and Cuban leader Fidel Castro agreed that Soviet nuclear missiles based on the island nation would prevent any future U.S. invasion attempts. When, on October 14, 1962, a United States U-2 aircraft returned with photographs showing definite evidence of sites for medium-range and intermediate-range ballistic nuclear missiles, what came to be known as the Cuban Missile Crisis was underway. Immediately, President Kennedy and the Joint Chiefs, as well as other top military advisors, began to plan for and stop what could have been the kickoff of all-out nuclear war. Without a formal declaration of war on Cuba, international law and convention would prohibit a naval blockade against the island. A system of quarantine was initiated, whereby U.S. Navy aircraft carriers, destroyers, and other vessels would not permit any transit of munitions or ordnance of any type to enter the country. Merchant ships and food and supply ships were allowed to pass after inspection. With the quarantine came the demand from the United States: remove and disassemble the missile bases on Cuba and send all offensive weapons back to the Soviet Union. Kennedy expected military retaliation from the Soviets, but 13 days later, the Soviet Union and Kennedy's cabinet reached an agreement, sending all of the Cuban missiles back to the USSR in exchange for the United States nuclear disarmament in Italy and Turkey. The crisis was perhaps the most tense moment of the Cold War and the closest we might have come to World War III.
It is one thing for politicians here at home, safe in the security of their political offices, to vote to send young American draftees to die in an unconscionable war in Vietnam. But it is another thing to be one of those boys. I do not intend to put their blood on my hands.
Vietnam was almost never a popular war. Its very beginnings sparked controversy, and continued American involvement in the conflict led to one of the lowest points for the United States Armed Forces. On August 2nd, 1964, the United States destroyer USS Maddox was conducting a secret intelligence mission in the Gulf of Tonkin off the coast of North Vietnam when it came under attack from 3 North Vietnamese Navy P-4 torpedo boats 28 miles away from the North Vietnamese coast in international waters. The Maddox suffered minor damage from only a 14.5 millimeter machine gun bullet. Also adding to the contention was an alleged second attack 2 days later on the Maddox and the USS Turner Joy, which has since been chalked up to a radar glitch and overzealous communications officers making incorrect reports. Nonetheless, President Johnson used the evidence presented to petition Congress to pass the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson authority to use conventional military force in any Southeast Asian country that displayed signs of communist aggression or expansion.
That I shall immediately request the Congress to pass a resolution making it clear that our government is united in its determination to take all necessary measures in support of freedom and in defense of peace in Southeast Asia.
For the first time since the American Civil War, U.S. Navy forces found themselves engaged in operations on rivers and other tributaries in Vietnam. The river patrols, or Brown Water Navy, consisted of river patrol boats or patrol air cushion vehicles, also known as hovercraft, that would patrol areas unable to be reached by their larger mothership. Also at play on the rivers was the patrol craft, also known as swift boats. The swift boats were largely responsible for intercepting movements of Viet Cong munitions and arms, as well as transportation of Vietnamese allies and SEAL teams there to quash insurgencies. Working in cooperation with the Navy was the United States Coast Guard, which operated 26 Point-class cutters on the rivers as well. As U.S. forces were scaled back, these vessels were all donated to the South Vietnamese Navy as part of the United States effort to hand the reins of the war over to the Vietnamese people. In the same speech that John F. Kennedy promised a man on the moon, he also outlined a proposal to form what would eventually become the United States Navy SEALs program. The allocated funds, over $100 million, went into developing the Navy Sea, Air, and Land Team, or Navy SEALs. The force traces its beginning back to the closing years of World War II, when the U.S. Navy Scouts and Raiders School was founded. The teams were utilized in secret anti-communist operations in Cuba, and by 1962, the Navy SEALs were at work in Vietnam. The men with green faces, as the Viet Cong called them, because of their camouflage face paint, became a force to be reckoned with, extremely effective in anti-guerrilla and guerrilla operations, and taking from the Viet Cong what was previously safe territory for the enemy. The Navy SEALs still operate today under extreme secrecy and on more dangerous missions than ever. On May 2nd, 2011, SEAL Team 6 successfully completed its mission to kill Osama bin Laden, the terrorist leader and head of Al-Qaeda responsible for planning the attacks on the United States of September 11th, 2001, after a decade-long manhunt as part of the War on Terror. Since the Vietnam War and the fall of the USSR, the United States Navy has continued to develop newer, faster, and more efficient warships and weapons. The U.S. Navy, in response to the lessened threat of nuclear strike, began to position its fleets in order to better serve special operations and strike missions in regional conflict, rather than preparing them for full-scale nuclear war with the Soviets. Today, the Navy is an integral part of the War on Terror, participating in actions during Operations Iraqi Freedom and Enduring Freedom, and in Operation Odyssey Dawn in 2011, launching cruise missiles into military targets in Libya in order to enforce UN resolutions and rid the country of its oppressive regime.
Our action in the Gulf is about fighting aggression and preserving the sovereignty of nations. It is about keeping our word, our solemn word of honor, and standing by old friends. It is about our own national security interests and ensuring the peace and stability of the entire world.
Just after 10 a.m. on the morning of May 17, 1987, an Iraqi Mirage F-1 fighter jet descended on the USS Stark, sailing off the coast of Saudi Arabia near the exclusion boundary of the Iran-Iraq War. The jet fired two 1,500-pound Exocet missiles upon the frigate, killing 29 in the explosion and resulting fire, and 8 more after the incident from burns. It remains unclear as to whether the pilot of the Mirage was acting under orders, or if it truly was, as Saddam Hussein later called it, an unintentional accident. However, the attack remains the only successful anti-ship missile strike on any American warship. Operation Desert Storm in 1991 saw hundreds of Tomahawk II cruise missiles launched from naval warships in the Persian Gulf, and the battleships USS Missouri and USS Wisconsin firing their 16-inch guns for the first time since the Korean War. Targets in Kuwait were struck, meant to drive out invading Iraqi forces, and the unending barrage from U.S. Navy weapons defeated and sent back the Iraqi army after only 100 hours. Prior to these bombings, Operation Desert Shield saw more than 240 ships carrying 18.3 billion pounds of supplies and equipment into Saudi Arabia to sustain the U.S. and Allied troops in the impending campaigns. The United States Navy's superiority on the seas also helped enforce United Nations trade sanctions against Iraq, crippling leader Saddam Hussein's economic lifeline.
When a crisis confronts the nation, the first question often asked by policymakers is, what naval forces are available and how fast can they be on station?
The terrorist organization Al-Qaeda has long professed to be an enemy of the United States. Before the attacks of September 11, 2001, there were the U.S. Embassy bombings of 1998 and the suicide attack on the USS Cole in 2000. The U.S. Navy guided missile destroyer was docked in Aden Harbor, Yemen, when a small boat sidled up to the destroyer's port side and exploded. The concussion created a 40 by 40-foot hole in the side of the ship, killing 17 and injuring another 39. Rules of engagement kept the crew from firing upon the small boat, which approached without answering radio calls or requesting permission. In fact, Petty Officer John Washak was ready to fire upon another suspicious craft nearby when he was told by a senior chief petty officer, "No shooting unless we're shot at." In the wake of the USS Cole attack and the ongoing war on terror, the U.S. Navy has begun to reevaluate the rules of engagement. 11 carriers, 22 cruisers, 61 destroyers, 26 frigates, 2 combat ships, 53 submarines, 122 surface warships. There are currently 10 fleets or commands controlled by the United States Navy today, with a wide range of specializations and strategic positions across the globe. The Naval Reserve Force is represented in each of the United States and Puerto Rico and Guam by at least one Navy Operational Support Center where the selective reservist sailors perform their monthly drills. The United States Navy today maintains facilities in North America, Europe, Asia, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific Rim. The largest base overseas is located in Yokosuka, Japan. In 2007, the United States reached its smallest fleet size since World War I, with 274 active ships. The small number, however, is more than made up for in the amount of firepower and the sheer size of some vessels compared to earlier ships. The technological advances propelled by the Navy have ensured that our sailors are an unparalleled nautical force. The men and women who serve in the United States Navy help in preserving peace every single day in many corners of the globe. Unofficial mottos for the Navy include honor, courage, commitment, and not for self, but for country. They are our first line of defense on either of our coasts and first responders to remote regional crises. The battle fleet tonnage of our Navy's ships is larger than the next 13 largest navies combined. While in the past, the Navy's fate seemed uncertain, there should remain no question that the United States Navy is an entirely integral, and some might say, the most important part of the United States Armed Forces.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.